Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel and thank you for joining me for another true crime deep dive into a case that has not only been requested quite a bit, like for years since I've started this channel, but also a case that I've been personally interested in for over a decade. In today's video and the following two videos, I believe, we're going to be going over in detail the disappearances of 9-year-old Jane Beaumont, her sister, 7-year-old Arna Beaumont, and their little brother, 4-year-old Grant Beaumont. This is the longest-running missing persons case in Australian history, and it resulted in one of the largest police investigations in Australian history. It was Australia Day 1966 when the siblings were allowed to board a bus and travel from their home in Somerton Park to Glenelg, a bustling beachside suburb in Adelaide. At the time, no one even suggested that these three young children should not have been in such a busy and public place without adult supervision because it was seen as safe and acceptable by many Australians to allow their children to roam and explore and not to be constantly supervised. But the disappearance of the three Beaumont children, along with other horrific and highly publicized crimes involving children, such as the abduction of 8-year-old Graham Thorne in 1960 and the 1965 Wanda Beach murders, they marked an end to the innocence of post-World War II Australian life. Crime writer Michael Madigan, who's from Adelaide, has said, quote, "After the Beaumont children went missing, we realized that children doing something as innocent as having a day out at the beach may not be such a safe thing to do. There was a sense of safety that ended that day." And in my opinion, this case has become so enduring and has drawn so many of us in because we do have something here that is highly out of the ordinary and hugely unthinkable. We can, of course, recognize and admit that children everywhere can fall victim to a predator. They can be abducted. And many of them who are taken by strangers, they never make it home. And that thought sends a chill through any person, whether you're a parent or not. However, in this case, we have three children, three young siblings who vanished into thin air. And in one day, a happy and loving family of 5 transformed into two despondent, tortured, and broken parents who had to somehow continue on living after losing every single one of their children in one foul swoop. As difficult as it is to put ourselves in the shoes of a parent who has lost one child to an abduction, it's impossible to be able to even touch the surface of what Jim and Nancy Beaumont felt and went through in 1966 and what they had to live with for the rest of their lives. The reality is that Jane, Arna, and Grant did not vanish into thin air. Something happened to them. Someone took them, and that person or people, they may have had other connections to other missing children who are also presumed to be dead, such as 11-year-old Joanne Ratcliffe and 4-year-old Kirsty Gordon, who were abducted from the Adelaide Oval during a football game in August of 1973. There's also a possibility that this case is related to Bevan Spencer Von Ehnen, a convicted child murderer and suspected serial killer who lived and operated in the Adelaide area. We're going to talk about all of that and other theories, but first, let's have a word from the sponsor of today's video, GlassesUSA.com. I don't have to tell you because you're looking at me right now, but I wear glasses, and in my opinion, your eyeglasses can be more important than your clothes. Because you need your glasses to see, and also because they're always on your face, and your face is usually the first thing people see when they meet you, and I like to put my best face forward and show off some beautiful and stylish frames. And there's no better place to get my beautiful and stylish frames from than GlassesUSA.com. GlassesUSA.com is one of the biggest eyewear retailers in the U.S., offering over 10,000 prescription eyeglasses and sunglasses at up to 70% off retail prices, starting at only $39, which is a crazy low price. You know what's even crazier? This holiday season, GlassesUSA.com has tons of exclusive offers that you won't find anywhere else. Plus, if you have FSA or HSA dollars that you've been saving all year, then use them ASAP and you'll basically get your glasses for free. Now, I've linked these special offers in the description box down below, so check them out. And we all know that online shopping can be really fun. I love it, but it also can be incredibly overwhelming, especially when there's so many options. But GlassesUSA.com makes it so easy, and I truly enjoy shopping for my glasses because they have some amazing tools that can help you find your perfect pair. One of these is the virtual try-on tool. It's so easy, it's so fun to use. You just snap a picture of yourself or upload a picture that you already have, and you can honestly go ham. You can try on dozens of different frames. Hey, you can try on hundreds of frames if you have the time, and you can really get an idea of what shape and size and color looks the best on you. Now, I have played with this virtual try-on tool for over an hour before. I'm not even ashamed to admit it. I just like to, see the different frames, different sizes. I like some oversized frames, maybe some slimmer frames, but I like to see how each of them looks on my face. And I have used this tool to find all of my frames. And it was really helpful because I was able to take my time and see what looks flattering on me. And I mean, not only can you try the different frames on different size frames, but all sorts of different colors, different patterns, just to see what looks best on you. And shopping online with GlassesUSA.com is a completely risk-free experience. They offer free shipping and free returns and 100% money-back guarantee if you don't love your glasses within 14 days. And if you have the Klarna app, you can buy now and pay later. Go to GlassesUSA.com right now and check out their holiday offers. Don't forget to use your FSA or HSA dollars before they expire at the end of the year. And once again, with the Klarna app, you can even buy now and pay later. Click on the links in the top of my description box to get all the details about these offers, details about the glasses I'm wearing right now in this video. And thank you so much to GlassesUSA.com for sponsoring today's video. I love GlassesUSA.com. I get all my eyeglasses from them, all my sunglasses from them, and I will continue to because it's just the best deal and the easiest shopping experience for me. With all of that being said, let's dive into the video. Adelaide is the capital city of southern Australia, and it's situated at the base of the low-lying Mount Lofty Ranges, 9 miles inland from the center of the eastern shore of the Gulf St. Vincent. Adelaide is South Australia's metropolitan coastal capital with a Mediterranean climate, bringing scorching hot summers and mild winters. And Adelaide has over 20 beaches along its metropolitan coastline, including Glenelg, located on the shore of Holdfast Beach. Glenelg is the most popular beach and the easiest one to access from the city. Adelaide is a bustling city, but it's said you can get anywhere in it within 20 minutes. And all you'd have to do to get to Glenelg Beach is to hop on a bus or a tram and get off at Moseley Square, just steps from the water. Moseley Square is located right between Glenelg Beach and Jetty Road. Jetty Road is a popular shopping and dining area that extends a little bit over a half a mile going towards the water. And I think it's called Jetty Road because it travels through Moseley Square and right into the jetty that extends into the ocean. But fun fact, and I'll try not to throw too many of these at you because I know that we're here for a reason and I know I have a tendency to get distracted by cool things. But listen, the first Glenelg jetty was 381 meters long. And then towards the end of it, they built a 3-level pavilion in 1906. And then they also built an aquarium that had fish and sea lions and sharks. They built that on the jetty in 1929. But then a huge storm hit Holdfast Bay in 1946 and it wiped the jetty out, leaving only the pavilion and the aquarium. And look at this picture. It's wild. You can see everyone's just standing in Moseley Square looking at this pavilion and this aquarium that are just chilling out there in the ocean, which is insane. What a cool thing to see. I hope the sharks and the sea lions and the fish were able to get out. But clearly, the whole point is this is a very popular area. It's a popular area for tourists, a popular area for locals, and it's always been a place where people have gone to escape the extremely hot temperatures during summer. Even thousands of years ago, before Colonel William Light discovered the shores of South Australia, when the Kaurna people would seek refuge from the heat, they would do it in Glenelg. On average, temperatures can reach 88 degrees in Adelaide, but they can get much warmer than that, especially in January, which is the hottest month. So for us, or like at least in the United States, summer is in what I consider to be the summer months, like June, July, August. But in Australia, the winter months for us are actually the summer months for them, which I was always curious about because do Australians celebrate Christmas when it's hot out? They must, right? So, for instance, temperatures on January 24th, 2019 hit 118 degrees. January 23rd, 1982 showed a high of 112 degrees, and in 1966, when the Beaumont children went missing, temperatures in January were well over 100 degrees many days. The Beaumont children, along with thousands of other sticky and sweaty people, had spent a lot of time at Glenelg Beach, enjoying the refreshing water and the cool sea breezes during the prolonged heat spell of that January. And for much of that time, the children's father, Jim Beaumont, had been with them because he'd actually been enjoying a 4-week holiday from his job as a traveling linen salesman, and he really loved the beach. Like, the kids loved the beach, Jim loved being at the beach, and he loved being at the beach with them. In fact, the day before his children vanished, Jim had spent a few hours with them at the beach, smiling as he watched them run through the sand, splash in the surf, and play together in the shade when the sun got too high in the sky. Jane Beaumont was the eldest, at the ripe old age of 9 years old. She was described as being tall and slim, quiet and reserved, the most intelligent and sensible out of the 3 siblings, and also the most shy. Jane was a little mother to her younger sister and brother, often helping to care for them and reminding them of their manners when they were in the presence of adults. But she also kept a very careful eye on Arna and Grant to always make sure they were safe. Jane's school friend, Jenny Muirhead, said that if Jane went into the ocean with Grant, who was just 4, she would always tell him to only go as deep as he could without getting his belly button wet. And Jane would remind Grant that he was not allowed in past the band of his swim trunks, and if he didn't obey her, she would be very cross with him. 2 nights before she had vanished, Jane had written a short letter to her parents, who had left her with her 2 younger siblings for a few hours while they went out for an evening. The letter said, quote, "Dear Mom and Dad, I'm just about to go to bed and the time is 9. I have put Grant's nappy on, so there's no need to worry about him wetting the sheet. Grant wanted to sleep in his own bed, so one of you will have to sleep with Arna. Although you will not find the rooms in very good condition, I hope you will find them as comfortable as we do. Good night to you both, Jane. P.S. I hope you had a very nice time wherever you went. P.P.S. I hope you don't mind me taking your radio into my room, Daddy." Jane's mother, Nancy Beaumont, said that Jane was a lovely girl and an amazing daughter. She never had to ask Jane to help with the dishes or to help clean up, and Jane kept her own room perfectly neat and organized, like a little department store, everything in its place. Jane's father, Jim, he said that his oldest daughter was only 9, but she had the mind of a 15-year-old, and she knew her way around Adelaide so well that sometimes he would make a wrong turn on purpose while they were out driving to see if she would correct him, and she always did. Jane's friend, Jenny Muirhead, agreed with this, saying, quote, "She was really quite amazing. She could catch a bus anywhere around Somerton, Brighton, Glenelg," end quote. Jane dreamed of one day becoming an author, and she was happiest in a quiet corner with a good book, an opportunity she probably didn't get enough of with her 2 younger siblings, who were significantly more outgoing and energetic than she was. Arna Beaumont was the actress of her family, a little 7-year-old girl with a huge personality who was always singing and dancing and who was incredibly affectionate. It was said that Arna lived in a fantasy world of her own creation, always dressing up and playing out these characters and convincing her siblings and parents to play their own parts. Whereas Jane was sometimes painfully shy, Arna had no such reservations, and little Grant, at just 4 years old, was his father's shadow. He loved playing with his older sisters, but he would always much rather be with his father. Even at such a young age, it was clear that little Grant was bright and quick, and he was able to pick up on things very easily. He watched everything that his father did and mimicked everything that his father did, and he would often help Jim Beaumont do regular maintenance on the family car, remembering what the parts were called and where they went. Grant's two older sisters spoiled him, and they treated him like a little doll to be dressed up, fed, and bathed, even though Grant did not really like taking baths at all, and he was an incredibly picky eater. For a time, the only way that his mother could get food into his mouth was by playing a game on the swing in their backyard, where she would put Grant in the swing, she would push him, and then she would pop the spoon in his mouth every time he swung forward towards her. And I guess he seemed amused enough by this little game to allow the food to pass his lips. Jane, Arna, and Grant Beaumont lived with their parents in the Adelaide suburb of Somerton Park at 109 Harding Street, a cute, modest little house with a backyard that was littered with the elements of a happy childhood, a swing in the backyard that Jane would push her little brother and sister on, a freshly painted red go-kart that Jim Beaumont had built for his son, and a brand new bike that Arna had just gotten for Christmas. And there are so many beautiful, heartwarming pictures of these three children because I do believe that they were very, very loved. And their father, Jim, he truly enjoyed capturing even the most basic moments of their lives. He had purchased his first camera in Japan when he'd been stationed there during the war, and he'd put together dozens of photo albums filled with memories of his family and their many adventures together. But on January 25th, 1966, the fun and the adventures had to be put on hold, at least for a little while, because Jim had to get back to work. After bringing the kids to Glenelg Beach and watching them play for a few hours, Jim gave each of his children a hug and a kiss, and he told them that he would see them very soon. And then he hit the road, heading to Snowtown, which was about 90 miles away from Adelaide. And to be completely honest, it did seem like the Beaumont children were often left to their own devices, such as this day, January 25th, where we would have to assume since Jim left, the kids would have to find their own way home. But reportedly, this was pretty common in Australia, where kids as young as 5 or 6 years old would take public transportation alone and walk themselves to school in the morning. A 2020 article on news.com.au claims, quote, Australia was regarded as a safe place to raise children, and many kids in neighborhoods across the country enjoyed a free-range upbringing. The next day, January 26th, was another scorcher, and on top of that, it was Australia Day, a national holiday that marks the 1788 landing of the first fleet at Sydney Cove, which was the precursor to the official establishment of the colony of New South Wales. This was the fleet of 11 ships from Portsmouth, England, which carried over 1,400 people, mainly convicts from England. Another fun fact, reportedly, Adelaide is the only capital city in Australia that was not settled by convicts. It was actually established in 1836 as a planned capital for free British settlers, and it seems like this has made some of the locals in Adelaide feel and act a bit smug and superior to their other Australian counterparts. I don't know if that's true, okay? That's the hot tea, that's the gossip. If you live in Australia and you know, let us know in the comments. We all are waiting to see. So Jim Beaumont, he was out of town working. The kids were off of school for the summer or the winter, I guess it would be the winter there. And it was a national holiday, so of course, the Beaumont children woke up early at 7 a.m., much to the chagrin of their mother, Nancy, who was also woken up when Grant and Arna began tearing around the house, playing loudly and causing a ruckus. And within the first seconds of Nancy's eyes being open, all three of her children were begging her to bring them back to Glenelg Beach because it was going to be another really hot day, with temperatures predicted to once again rise above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Nancy gave in, and she promised the kids that she would bring them to the beach once she completed her chores and her work for the day. They all had breakfast together, they had a nice morning, but as Nancy began clearing the breakfast plates, the kids started up again, asking when she was going to be done with her chores so that they could leave already. And for the next hour, they bugged her and begged her repeatedly, "Are you done yet? Are you done yet?" Finally, Nancy became exasperated, and she told Jane, Arna, and Grant that they could go to the beach alone as long as they promised not to go too deep into the water. She didn't even allow them to bring their paddle boards that day because she didn't want them in water that was deep enough to paddle in, and she made them promise to be home for lunch. Now, initially, Nancy considered having them ride their bikes to the beach, but she worried because it was already so hot, even at that early hour, and the bus ride to the beach was only 5 minutes, where they could be cool and they wouldn't be out in the hot sun. So once again, I know this sounds shocking to a lot of us, especially those of us who live in the United States in 2022, because we probably would not feel comfortable allowing a 9-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a 4-year-old to take a bus alone and then hang out at a beach alone, especially on a holiday when it's busy and there's going to be a lot of people there. But this was a different time and a different place, and reportedly, the kids often did this, especially the two older girls, Jane and Arna, who would usually go to the movies alone together every Saturday. And it shouldn't have been a big deal for the kids to go to the beach alone, especially since they'd done it before. They'd been there with their father almost every day all summer. They'd been there alone sometimes during the summer, and I know, like I said, it's January, but in Australia, January is summer. At least it's summer weather. So it's our summer. I know it's complicated for me, so I'm not trying to confuse you, but I am confused in the way where I'm going to have a hard time saying that January, when it's over 100 degrees, is winter. Do Australians consider that to be summer because it's summer weather, or do they still call it winter? I know I have a lot of people from Australia watching because I can see the breakdown on my channel, and there's actually a lot of people from Australia. I love you guys so much. We've talked about it before. I think Australians have the best sense of humor. You guys are awesome. So let me know in the comment section what's going on with the summer-winter thing. Just let this stupid American know. So the distance from the Beaumont home to Glenelg Beach was the same as the distance from the Beaumont home to, their school. And the kids walked to school alone every morning. So things like that, you don't think about it. You don't think that there's danger out there because they haven't been in danger before. And like I said, this was very common. Australians used to just let their kids run around and be independent, and we should be able to do that, right? I wish we could, because I think that it does give young kids a sense of independence, a sense of, we are able to do things for ourselves, and therefore, it helps them grow into more responsible adults. It's better than babying them, right, and putting them in a bubble and doing everything for them. But at the same time, we don't really have that luxury, especially in 2022, to allow our kids to go out and get the lay of the land and figure out the world without us constantly behind them. We don't feel safe enough to allow that to happen, but we should feel safe enough to allow that to happen. In a perfect world, in a utopia, we would, and I think that kids would be better off if they were outside playing and if they were able to frolic and, use their imaginations more and just kind of go out and be kids and grow up to be, more resilient and resourceful adults. But that's neither here nor there because it's not possible nowadays. But it seems like people in Australia during the 1960s did think that it was possible, and maybe for a while it was possible. At 8:30 a.m., Jane, Arna, and Grant each kissed their mother, Nancy, goodbye. She walked them out to the front gate, waving and watching them walk along Harding Street to the corner of Diagonal Road, where the bus would pick them up. Jane turned around to wave back at her mother. She was wearing a pink bathing suit, green shorts, and canvas sand shoes with white soles. She was clutching onto her well-worn copy of Little Women, a book that had fast become her favorite, and in her little white money purse jingled the coins that her mother Nancy had given her, 85 cents for bus fare and a little something extra, like a cold treat at the beach. 7-year-old Arna also looked back to smile as her mother waved. Arna was wearing a white and red striped bathing suit with tan shorts and tan sandals, and her little brother Grant, who bounced next to her, was wearing green swim trunks with white stripes under green cotton shorts with red sandals on his feet. And Grant didn't have a shirt on, and Nancy was asked about this later because everybody blamed her. This is your fault, of course, blame the mother. But this is your fault, you shouldn't have let them do that. And she was also asked, why didn't Grant have a shirt on? And she said, listen, it was like a 5-minute bus ride to the beach. I knew they were going to step off the beach. I knew they were going to get right in the water, in the shallow water, cool off, hang out at the beach a little bit, play, and then come right home. I thought it would be less for his sisters to do to get him dressed and undressed. I thought that this was just the right thing. I didn't think that it would be an issue. Now, remembering the moment that she watched her 3 children walk away from her forever, Nancy Beaumont said, quote, "They turned around and waved to me. I went inside without a care in the world." By 10 a.m., Nancy had finished up her chores, so she decided to ride her bike to the home of a friend who lived nearby. But she made sure to leave her friend's house at 5 minutes to noon because she wanted to be at the bus stop when Jane, Arna, and Grant got home. The bus rumbled up right around noon, and Nancy watched one elderly woman get off. But then the doors of the bus swished shut, and the bus continued on. Nancy shook her head. She was a little annoyed that the children had not taken the afternoon bus home as she had asked them to do. But she wasn't concerned at that point. Jane, Arna, and Grant had been to the beach by themselves dozens of times that month, and sometimes they were a little late getting home. They'd get caught up building sand castles and playing, and they would miss the afternoon bus. But she assumed they would be on the next bus from Glenelg Beach, which would arrive at 2 p.m. Nancy went home and she began to prepare lunch, which is what she was doing when a few of her friends stopped by for a visit. Nancy began to chat with her friends, but she kept an eye on the clock. And when her children were not home by 2:15 p.m., Nancy did begin to worry. Her friends noticed that she was concerned, and they offered to drive her over to the beach so she could look around for the 3 children. But Nancy was worried that if she left, maybe the kids would be on their way home, and they would miss each other, and they would get home and she wouldn't be home. So she decided to just wait a little bit longer to see if they would get off at the 3 p.m. bus. Now, it was around 3 p.m. that Jim Beaumont arrived home from his business trip to find a very stressed out and anxious wife. Nancy told Jim that the kids had gone to the beach for the day, but they hadn't returned yet. And initially, Jim wasn't too concerned at first. He figured the kids would be home within the hour, but he told Nancy, to make you feel better, I will go and check. I'll bring them home if I find them, but you stay home in case the kids show up. So we'll have all of our bases covered. And Jim would then go and drive around and look for them. By 3:30 p.m., Jim Beaumont was at Glenelg Beach, and he was peering through the scorching heat and throngs of people who had all gone to the shore to get some relief and to celebrate the holiday. He said later that there were so many people there that there was just, people packed on the beach that just scanning the beach, he wouldn't have been able to see them at all, and he didn't see them on the beach. So Jim went to the same area that his children had been the previous day, the lawn of the Coley Reserve, but they weren't there either. Tucked behind the buildings along Glenelg Beach, Coley Reserve is a peaceful, open-lawned area that's great for getting some shade, resting on a bench, and watching kids play kickball just steps away from the beach. Well, at least in 1966, it was steps away from the beach. At that time, Coley Reserve was the entire grassed area north of the jetty, including the grassed sea frontage. But now it's been, pushed back quite a bit due to high rises and things being built in front of the beach. I haven't been there personally, but I don't even know if you can see the water from Coley Reserve anymore, which is sad. So after not finding them on the beach or on the lawn at Coley Reserve, Jim told himself that the children must have just made it home by then. They either took the bus or they had missed the buses and they walked home. So he drove back to Somerton Park. But all he found at home was Nancy, who was growing more concerned and frantic by the minute. And anybody who's ever lost track of their children understands this feeling. At that point, even Jim began to panic, and he and his wife drove back to the beach to divide and conquer, looking for Jane, Arna, and Grant together, frantically running around, searching for them and yelling their names. But by 5 p.m., the Beaumonts, they acknowledged that they needed some help, and they went together to the Glenelg police station in Mosley Square to report that their 3 children were missing. Jim later said that by this point he did know something was very wrong. He said the kids would often go off by themselves, but they always came home when they said they would. But at first, Jim wasn't even considering that his children had crossed paths with someone who had nefarious intentions. Abduction wasn't even on his mind, even though that is the first place, the first place my mind goes to when I've lost, sight of my kids for a second or a minute. He was actually more concerned that the kids had gone into the water, they'd gone too deep into the ocean and drowned. But he also told himself there was far too many people on the beach that day for something like that to have happened and for no one to notice. And would all three of them have drowned together? You would think that, one of them would have made it and been able to report back. So that's what he was concerned about. But he was also, comforting himself and saying probably that didn't happen. There's too many people around and it's just highly unlikely. And Jane knows better than to let her younger siblings get too deep. After filing the initial report at the police station, Jim and Nancy returned home, and they were soon joined there by two police officers who came to take descriptions of the three children and then also to search the Beaumont home to make sure the kids weren't playing games or hiding from their parents. Once it was clear that there were no mischievous children secreted away in the kitchen cupboards, the police officers left to look for Jane, Arna, and Grant, taking Jim with them and leaving Nancy home in case by some miracle the kids showed up, even though it was getting later and the sun was starting to set. Now, of course, there was always the hope that the children had missed the last bus and they had decided to walk home. This was 1966. There were no cell phones. Jane wouldn't be able to get in contact with her parents and let them know what was happening. In fact, I will even say, as far as I know, the Beaumonts didn't even have a telephone installed at their house because after the kids went missing, the police had one installed at their house so that the police could keep in contact with the Beaumonts and give them updates about the investigation. So even if Jane had called from a shop, she wouldn't have been able to get through. The only really recourse that they would have, the kids, if they missed all the buses, would be to walk home or catch a ride. And their mother had warned them to never get into a vehicle with strangers, so they probably would have just walked home. So Jim Beaumont, he went back to Glenelg Beach with the police to keep searching for his kids, and he spent the rest of the night walking the beaches or sitting in the back of a police car, slowly driving down street after street, looking for any sign of his children. And when he went back to the beach with the police, he said it was still so smotheringly hot that thousands of people were still on the beach, even at midnight, which is bananas to me. When the sun started to peek over the horizon, though, the police finally brought Jim home. They told him, listen, we're going to keep looking for your kids, obviously, but you should get some rest. We'll keep you up to date on what we discovered. But of course, logically, was Jim Beaumont going to be able to, get some rest? Was he going to be able to go to sleep and get a good night's sleep and get up and start fresh in the morning? Of course not. Not while his children were out there somewhere. Not while he didn't know what was happening to them. So as soon as the police cruiser pulled away from his house, Jim jumped back into his own vehicle and drove back to Glenelg Beach. According to the South Australian police log, there were officers searching Glenelg Beach by 7 p.m. and by 8:40 p.m. officers were also searching Brighton Beach, West Beach, and Henley Beach. And as you can see from this map here, the beaches of Adelaide are sort of all in a line down the shore, with Glenelg nestled between Brighton Beach and West Beach. So law enforcement had expanded their search area in the event that the children had left the Glenelg Beach area, which wouldn't be an uncommon or hard thing to do. Many people enjoy the scenic view while walking along the shoreline from beach to beach. By 5 a.m. the next morning, the Sea Rescue Squadron had sent out 5 boats to search the shoreline from Glenelg south to Aldinga and back to Henley Beach, checking hollows and caves, and thus began the largest missing person search in Australian history. Not only were the police involved, but also the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and thousands of concerned citizens, all searching for 3 children who seemed to have vanished into thin air. There was no evidence left behind of these kids. Nothing. None of their belongings, their clothing, nothing. It was really insane to think about that. Like I said, they thought these kids had disappeared into thin air. Nothing was left behind. All seaside suburbs and the shore were searched to a distance of 30 miles south of Adelaide. The sandhills of North Glenelg were searched along with the rocks at the base of the cliff faces. They checked storm drains that opened up onto the beaches. They opened those, they flushed them, they checked everywhere they could think of. Not one scrap of evidence that indicated what had happened to the Beaumont children was found.
Under the manhole in the Broadway.
That's true.
Now, do you believe that the children are in this pipe? Do you think that there's a possibility they could be there?
On January 29th, the Padawalanga boat haven was drained after a woman told police that she had approached and spoken to 3 children who she had seen there on the evening of January 26th around 7 p.m. She said that these kids matched the descriptions of the Beaumont children. She said she'd asked them for directions, but they had told her that they weren't from the area. So to give you some perspective on where this boat launch is located, if you were standing with your back to the ocean, to the water, and Coley Reserve was in front of you, the boat haven would be to your left, behind Holdfast Bay.
No place was left unsearched. The local boat harbour was drained, a massive operation.
The Padawalanga Boat Haven in Glenelg, South Australia, in what is the latest development and perhaps the most dramatic one yet. The haven is going to be drained and the police will then inspect it.
Dozens of police and cadets probed the waist-high mud.
We actually all held our breath while people looked for them, while the Padawalanga was dragged.
This is one of the jobs where they hope they don't have any luck whatsoever.
On and on it went. Surely, somewhere, somehow, they would find a scrap of clothing, a shred of evidence.
You know, everything that happened, we held our breath and thought, finally we're going to find what happened to them.
How's it going?
But each lead failed.
And these were incredibly thorough searches, as you can even see from that clip. Even in the water, they were performing very organized, tight grid searches. Within the first few days, there was the belief that it was possible all 3 children had drowned. But it was a very unlikely scenario to have 3 people drown at the same time and to not have a body or a piece of clothing from any of the 3 turn up anywhere. And besides, Jane was so careful with her younger siblings. She never even let Grant go into the water past his belly button. And then the eyewitnesses began to come forward, and the world got a clearer picture of what the Beaumont children had done and where they'd been that day. And the most terrifying part of all of this was that many of the eyewitness statements put the children in the company of a strange man, or a stranger, a man who was described as a surfie, which apparently is Australian slang for a guy who looks like his only interest is surfing and who seems to be really interested in like surfing subculture. From what I got when I was looking it up trying to figure out what a surfie was, it was somebody who didn't really surf but who kind of just wanted to pose as a surfer, who kind of wore clothes and used slang that surfers would use but wasn't technically an actual surfer. This man was described as being in his late 30s, standing at 6'1" with a slim build and longish blonde hair that looked like it needed to be cut. His hair was parted to one side, he had a naturally fair but very suntanned complexion, and his face was thin. When Nancy and Jim Beaumont heard this description, they couldn't think of one person they knew who matched it. Now, let's go over the eyewitness statements and see if we can't piece together the movements of Jane, Arna, and Grant Beaumont on that fateful day. But before I get into that, I do want to talk for just a minute about why eyewitness testimony is very unreliable. Because in this situation and so many others, if we believe every one of these eyewitness statements, the timeline can't possibly work. So we have to assume that some of these eyewitnesses may be wrong. They may be remembering a different day, they may be remembering seeing different children, or sadly, they may be just making things up to insert themselves into the case. And I do believe that it's the exception, not the norm. But we also know from past cases, it does happen. People just confess to crimes sometimes when they had nothing to do with it. They say they have evidence or they have information when they don't. They just want attention. They want to insert themselves into this case. And it's bizarre and normal people don't understand it, but it happens. So let's see what's going on with these eyewitness statements, because according to Scientific American, quote, The uncritical acceptance of eyewitness accounts may stem from a popular misconception of how memory works. Many people believe that human memory works like a video recorder. The mind records events and then on cue plays back an exact replica of them. On contrary, psychologists have found that memories are reconstructed rather than played back each time we recall them. The act of remembering, says eminent memory researcher and psychologist Elizabeth Loftus of the University of California, Irvine, is more akin to putting puzzle pieces together than retrieving a video recording. Even questioning by a lawyer can alter the witness's testimony because fragments of the memory may unknowingly be combined with information provided by the questioner, leading to inaccurate recall, end quote. And I'm sure we all have some experience with this, right? Because if memory did work like a video being replayed back, we would never fight with our spouses, right? A lot of fights stem from one person perceiving an argument or an event happening a certain way and the other person perceiving it and remembering it completely different. And then you argue with that person where they're like, oh, you snapped at me. And then you're like, no, I didn't. I wasn't snapping. And they are dead set. Like they're going to die on the hill that you snapped at them. And you're over here like, I don't remember that happening. This is why we have to be very careful with eyewitness testimony, because they could be wrong. When Derek and I recently went over the Hayman Lee and Adnan Syed case in Crime Weekly, in 8 parts of Crime Weekly, we ran into this consistently. Constant eyewitness testimony that was later proved to be false, later proved that these eyewitnesses were thinking of completely different days, but they were sure that they were thinking of the day that they were asked about. So it does become an issue, and we have to keep that in mind as we go through this timeline. So initially, the papers had been printing that the children had taken the 10 a.m. bus from Somerton Park to Glenelg. I think it actually would pick them up around 10:15 in the morning. And this would later be corrected by Nancy Beaumont. She said in an interview that no, the kids didn't leave at 10 a.m. They got on the 8:45 a.m. bus. But that time does not coincide with the bus driver's recollection of Jane, Arna, and Grant getting on the bus. He claimed that he picked them up at the corner of Harding Street and Diagonal Road at around 10 a.m. Based on this statement, South Australian police released that time, 10 a.m., to the papers. But before Nancy corrected the timeline and before that correction was printed, a man came forward and he claimed that the timeline must be wrong because he said the kids had definitely taken an earlier bus, and he knew this because his wife saw them on the 8:45 a.m. bus from Somerton Park to Glenelg Beach. This man said that his wife had a clear memory of this day because it was her first day at a new job, and she'd arrived at Glenelg around 8:55 a.m. to start work at 9 a.m. Additionally, this woman was a cub mistress, meaning she worked with Cub Scouts, so she had a good eye for children. She wasn't likely to mistake one set of children for another. Reportedly, this man's wife remembered being surprised when the children got on the bus unsupervised, and she said the 2 younger children were standing only a few feet in front of her, while the older girl went to the back of the bus, sat down, and opened up a book. During the ride, the older girl had to tell her younger brother to stop putting his arm out the window of the bus, and this woman said, quote, he went to put his arm out again, but stopped and turned around and cheekily smiled at her. We have another eyewitness who saw Jane, Arna, and Grant get off the bus at the Mosley Street stop right around the corner from Jetty Road at 10:15 a.m. Now, let's look at this objectively. If Nancy Beaumont is correct that her children took the 8:45 a.m. bus, it's only about a 5 to 7 minute bus ride, and they should have been at Glenelg by 9 a.m. at the latest. And this time is corroborated by the woman who was riding, that same bus to Glenelg for her first day of work. Her statement was given to police before Nancy Beaumont corrected the official timeline, so it seems like her statement probably wasn't influenced by Nancy giving the correct timeline. She just really remembered this happening. I think the eyewitness who said that they saw the kids getting off the bus at 10:15 a.m. was influenced by the paper printing that 10 a.m. time. So this eyewitness may have seen the kids get off the bus that morning, but may have just said, oh, it must have been around 10:15 a.m. because that's what time the kids took the bus. So that would make sense that they got off at 10:15 a.m. So I'm not saying the person didn't see them getting off the bus. I'm saying that they were probably influenced by thinking it was a different time than it really was because of what was being printed in the papers. So I'm going to go ahead and say that they probably took the 8:45 a.m. bus, and that's probably the accurate timeline because their mother would know, and that woman who was on the bus with them had very specific details, remembering Jane reading her book at the back of the bus, remembering Grant being a little precocious, remembering that, Jane was kind of being a little mother to her younger siblings, things like that. It does seem that that's the accurate timeline here. And I also want to go back to the South Australian police log, which did make a note in the original missing persons report. The note said that Jim Beaumont initially reported his children had left home at 1 p.m. and they were supposed to be home by 5 p.m. His statement was later amended with the departure time changing to 10 a.m. and the time that the kids were supposed to be home changing to 2 p.m. Most likely this is also where the police got this from, and that's why they allowed the papers to print it. But then in another police report, we can see that the time the children left is typed in as 8:45 a.m. So once again, I think that 8:45 a.m. time is accurate, even though to this day, when people cover this case, they say 10 a.m. But, I think it's 8:45 a.m. that they got on the bus. Between 10:15 and 11 a.m., Jane, Arna, and Grant were seen swimming in the shallows near the jetty, and then they were seen running up to the lawn of the Coley Reserve, where they then spread their towels out and laid down. At 11 a.m., a 74-year-old woman who was sitting on a bench in front of the Holdfast Bay Sailing Club, which is no longer there today, but it was in 1966, so she's sitting on a bench in front of that club, and she claims she saw the Beaumont children come up from the water after a swim. They laid out their towels in a shaded and secluded corner of the foreshore, and then they began to run around and play in a sprinkler on the lawn. She said the kids had with them an Airways bag, which Nancy Beaumont did believe that Jane was carrying when she left home that morning. Jane was usually carrying that bag, and the bag would usually hold their 3 towels. Now, this older woman was actually able to remember that Jane, or who she referred to as the older girl, had a pink bathing suit on. Jane left the house that morning wearing a pink bathing suit. But this woman also saw a man wearing navy blue swim trunks who had unruly blonde hair laying on his own towel about 10 feet away from her on the Coley Reserve lawn and staring at the children, watching them. At 11:15 a.m., this same woman witnessed the 3 children approach the man. She said the younger 2 jumped on him, and the older girl began flicking him with her towel playfully. The eyewitness said, quote, "He was laughing and encouraging them as they played." End quote. Now, this woman said she remained on the bench at the Coley Reserve lawn for another 30 minutes or so, and when she left, the children and the man were still playing and having a great time. Now, around noon, an older couple who had just gotten to the lawn at Coley Reserve and had just settled onto a bench with their granddaughter, they watched as this same man helped the 3 children get dressed, assisting them in putting their shorts and shirts on over their bathing suits, which another woman, a middle-aged woman sitting nearby, also saw. And this middle-aged woman said she thought this was a strange dynamic considering the age of the older girl, who we believe to have been Jane. She felt that Jane looked old enough to dress herself. So the elderly couple who was sitting with their granddaughter on the bench, they then watched the man and the 3 children walk away. They walked to nearby changing rooms. The man was still wearing his blue swimming trunks, and he had his pants tucked under his arm. He entered the changing rooms, and the kids sat outside and waited for him. The man came out, dressed, and just after noon, the man approached the couple, the elderly couple with their grandchild, and he spoke to them. And he asked if they'd seen anyone messing with their clothes earlier. And he says, our clothes, like mine and the kids. He said that he wanted to know if anybody had been around the clothes or touching the clothes because they were missing some money. Now, the elderly couple said that this man spoke English with an Australian accent, and they told him, they were sorry they hadn't seen anything. They'd basically just sat down. They'd just gotten there around noon. They then watched the man walk back to the children, and all 4, the man and the 3 children, left the Coley Reserve lawn. Now, we know that right around this time, Nancy Beaumont was waiting at the bus stop in Somerton Park, waiting to meet her children who'd been instructed to take the midday bus home. But if this timeline is correct, they'd already missed it. After this, the children were seen at Wenzel's Cakes, a bakery on Mosley Street, directly across from the bus stop that the kids would take to go back home. A shop assistant remembered the 3 children coming in around lunchtime and purchasing several items, some pies, some pasties, and, other food in a separate lunch bag. And they paid for this food with a £1 note, which struck the police as odd considering Jane had left home that day with only coins, 8 shillings and a 6pence that her mother Nancy had given her. Nancy had not given Jane any paper money, so where did the kids get this £1 note from? Now, Nancy and Jim would later confirm that when their children were at Glenelg Beach, they would usually purchase their lunches at Wenzel's, and the shopkeeper claimed she'd seen the children there before, and when she saw them that day, she said they were alone. They'd purchased 5 pasties, 1 pie, 6 buns, and 2 large bottles of soda. And apparently, little Grant, he didn't like pasties, and so the pie was for him. The shop clerk remembered that as they were checking out and getting ready to pay, little Grant had asked, "Where's my pie?" because he was a kid who didn't eat pasties. And from what I can tell, pasties are kind of little like Hot Pockets. It's the best way I can describe them, kind of like little pies like wrapped in pastry, maybe, but Grant didn't like them. But if you look at what they bought, right, it does seem off that 3 children would purchase so much food. And I mean, they didn't even have enough money for that food, at least not enough money that their mother had given them. So it makes sense that it's possible the man they were with provided that money to them for lunch. He probably gave them that £1 note and requested that they buy him some food as well when they were in Wenzel's. Technically, this is the last confirmed sighting of the Beaumont children, but we also have a weird and changing statement from the Beaumont's mailman, Tom Patterson, who claimed that he had seen the children that day as well, walking along Jetty Road, heading towards Mosley Street. Patterson said that the kids were holding hands and laughing, and little Grant even pointed at him and said to his sisters, "There's our postie." Now, the problem is, initially, Tom Patterson told the police that the night of the disappearance, he'd either seen the kids at the start of his afternoon postal rounds, which would have been at like 1:45, or at the end of his rounds, which would have been around 2:55 p.m. The next day, Tom Patterson went back to the police and he said, "Listen, I've been thinking about this all night, trying to really figure out what time I saw them, and upon further consideration, I remember that right before I saw the kids, I forgot to deliver a parcel, and I had to go back and deliver that parcel, and that happened towards the end of my route. So I'm sure that it was closer to that 2:55, 3 p.m. time that I saw them." But then, 2 days later, Patterson returned to the police station and changed his statement once again, this time claiming it was in the morning he'd seen the Beaumont children. So once again, is Tom Patterson, the mailman, is he trying to be difficult? Is he trying to complicate things further? Is he trying to make the timeline more difficult? No, probably not. He's trying to reconstruct his memories to help, but because he probably saw the kids so often, it was hard to pinpoint that one specific day where he saw them and what time he saw them. Even though all of the pieces didn't line up perfectly, at least the police had something, right? They had sightings of the 3 children with a man who was a stranger to the children's parents, but maybe not a stranger to Jane, Arna, and Grant. As we know, the kids had been to Glenelg Beach several times that summer by themselves, and it would later be revealed during the investigation that Arna had previously told their mother that Jane had gotten herself a boyfriend down at the beach. And Nancy had discounted it at first. She thought that Arna was just teasing Jane and just messing with her, and she was like, "Jane's a 9. Jane is painfully, painfully shy. There's no way that there's any truth to this. These are just 2 sisters messing with each other," because then Jane would get mad when Arna would say that. The eyewitnesses from that day, Australia Day, 1966, they made it seem as if the children were sort of already familiar with the tall and thin man who had the complexion of someone who spent a lot of time at the beach. It's possible that the Beaumont children had encountered this man before that day, that they'd maybe even developed a relationship of some kind with him, enough of a relationship to trust him and not view him as a stranger. Their father, Jim, had been off from work for a lot of that summer, 4 weeks, and a lot of the time he would go to Glenelg Beach with his children, and sometimes they would go alone. But his presence would still sort of always be there throughout the summer, right? The man would have known that Jim Beaumont could have shown up anytime to check on the kids or to pick them up, but on this day, it's possible the Beaumont children told this man that their father had left for a business trip the day before, and that their mother had been too busy with her chores to accompany them to the beach that day. The Beaumonts, they only had one vehicle, and that vehicle was with Jim, far away from Glenelg Beach. Maybe the man felt he finally had an uninterrupted chance to steal away with Jane, Arna, and Grant. Maybe, while he was helping them get dressed, he grabbed Jane's little white change purse and he hid it or threw it away so that the kids wouldn't have money for bus fare home, so that they would waste time looking around for this money and miss the noon bus, and so that they would have to leave Coley Reserve with him. He could buy them lunch and further earn their trust, and then he could offer them a ride home. Since they'd missed the bus and they didn't have any money to pay for the bus anyways, maybe the kids would accept. I mean, they had already been given the standard warnings from their mother, don't get into cars or accept rides from strangers, so it's not likely they would have accepted a ride from a stranger, especially with Jane being so conscientious and shy and responsible when it came to following the rules and looking out for her younger siblings. Either this person, this man, this Surfy, snatched them off the street, which is hard to believe because there were 3 of them, or this man was working with other people, at least 2 others, so that the snatch and grab could have been coordinated. When you've got 3 kids, you'd want 3 people, or one of the kids is going to run away. Or this Surfy man, he wasn't a stranger to Jane, to Arna, to Grant, which is why Jane felt comfortable allowing herself and her little sister and little brother to get into a vehicle with him. When Nancy Beaumont heard that her children had been seen acting very friendly with this strange man, she could not make heads or tails of it. The eyewitness statements coming out did not match with what she knew about her kids, especially Jane. She said, quote, "If the other 2 were keen to be with somebody, Jane would go with them to look after them and wouldn't leave them alone. I cannot understand why Jane, a shy girl, much more so than Arna or Grant, would allow a man to put her shorts on, even over her bathers." The head of the Adelaide Homicide Squad, Detective Palmer, said, quote, "At the moment, we see a picture of a man striking up a conversation with the children. Arna, the 7-year-old girl, would approach anyone and have no fear. Arna could have frolicked around the man with her brother Grant. When Jane, the quiet and sensible one, had her confidence bolstered, she may have joined in," end quote. But, in my opinion, I tend to agree with Nancy on this one. Someone like Jane, who has been described as painfully shy, isn't going to get confidence to behave in such a familiar way with a complete stranger in the space of minutes, especially to the point where she would allow this stranger to help her get dressed. I even remember reading something in the book. The book was called The Missing Beaumont Children by Michael Madigan. And Nancy said in this book that her children loved their father so much. They always wanted to be with him. They always wanted to get attention from him, to the point where he would have to lock himself in a room if he wanted to read the paper alone. She said that Jim Beaumont, quote, "always bathed the kitties and dried them. He always tickles Grant and makes him giggle when he's drying him. When this happens, Arna always gets jealous and wants to be tickled too. Jane wants to be tickled, but she stands back and won't say anything when she sees the other 2 laughing," end quote. Nancy said that Jane was at an age where she was very particular about her body. She was developing an awareness that some things should be kept private, even from your parents. And that's why Nancy could not imagine Jane allowing some strange man, to put her shorts on for her. And I agree. Within no time, the details of the eyewitness statements were revealed, and the public was told to be on the lookout for anyone matching the description of the man seen with the Beaumont children. And that's exactly what the public did. There were reports of this tall, thin, surfy man coming in from all over Australia. Artist Peter Zarnecki worked with the police and one of the witnesses to create a composite sketch of the Surfy, and the finished product, it was not overly detailed. It looked pretty generic. The witness couldn't remember specific things like eye color and little details that would really round one of these composite sketches out. But when the sketch was shown to a second witness, that person did confirm that, the sketch did resemble the man they'd seen. And so that sketch was sent out to the media. One Australian man looked very much like that sketch, and he was arrested and questioned by police 3 times in 1 week. The first time, he was in the Adelaide airport when he saw people looking at him, and he even saw a few people writing down his license plate number as he pulled away from the airport. Now, he was obviously familiar with the publicized missing children's case. He put 2 and 2 together, and he drove right from the airport to the police station so they could kind of clear him and they could clear the whole situation up, which they eventually did, but not before the police arrested him because they also thought he looked like the sketch and interrogated him. They let him go eventually, but then a few days later, he was picked up in Glenelg, which is actually where he lived, and he was detained at the police station and once again interrogated for hours. And then just a few days after that, he was by the Adelaide Railroad station when a member of the public spotted him, called the police, and literally 7 police cars just screeched up within minutes and once again arrested him. In Western Australia, police detained a hitchhiker who resembled the suspect, and in Tasmania, police began a full-out search for a man who had been seen talking to a little boy in the Sandy Beach area. Reportedly, this man was over 6 feet tall, he was deeply suntanned, he had unkempt sandy blonde hair, and he'd been overheard talking to the little boy about Adelaide. Closer to home, several residents of Glenelg reported seeing a tall blonde man lurking around the beach during the day for several days leading up to the disappearances, and he had been seen watching children on the beach. Despite all of the tips and all of the sightings, no solid suspect would ever be identified by law enforcement. The media had been camping out in front of the Glenelg police station since the first day, waiting for updates, but these updates were few and far between. 2 days after Jane, Arna, and Grant vanished, an unnamed detective told a local paper, quote, "Nothing, absolutely nothing clicks into place, and unless we get a new lead, it's going to be hard to break." End quote. A few weeks later, another detective voiced his frustration, saying, quote, "The common denominator has been nothing. Where do we go now?" End quote. And yet another detective said, quote, "Anything factual about the Beaumont children came to a shuddering halt at 11:30 a.m. on Wednesday, January 26th. Try as we may, we cannot find one lead, which gives us a solid clue to their whereabouts beyond that time. Anything could have happened to them since." End quote. The media also camped out in front of the Beaumont's humble Somerton Park home, and Jim Beaumont took full advantage of their presence, allowing himself to be interviewed early on and appearing on television within 48 hours, trying to get his children's names and stories out to whoever would listen.
Jim Beaumont now divided his time between the police, the search, and the public appeal.
What sort of a girl is Jane, the 9-year-old? Is she...
Oh, very intelligent, very intelligent. You've only got to tell her a thing once, and she always does what she's told, never to talk to any strangers on the beach. When she swims there, always in groups.
Be quite able to look after the other 2?
Oh, quite capable, quite capable.
Jim Beaumont voiced his confusion over what had happened, saying, quote, "I hope whoever is holding my children will return them. In God's name, act quickly. If I'd won the lottery, I could understand it, and I would be willing to pay a ransom, but I'm just a salesman, and no one has approached us." I will say that I developed a great deal of respect for Jim and Nancy Beaumont during my research into this case because I read 2 books. I read 2 books and I read everything on the internet that I could find about this case. And I went even back to newspapers.com and I was reading articles from, the early days of the disappearance. I gained a huge amount of respect for Jim and Nancy Beaumont because this was the worst thing that could ever happen to somebody. It was the absolute worst thing that could ever happen to somebody. And the media, they're obnoxious. They always are. To camp out in front of these parents' house and just wait to get an update and just wait to get some juicy, story that you can put in your paper. It's kind of horrendous when these two people are literally in hell. But Nancy and Jim were always so warm, so receptive, and so welcoming to everybody. And that included media. That included random people knocking on their doors and saying they'd had a vision that the kids were like floating at the bottom of the ocean. That included random people who knocked on their door to tell them that they were bad parents because they'd let their kids disappear. That included random people who knocked on their door to talk about their own losses, their own children's deaths, things like that, looking for comfort and relatability from the Beaumonts. Everybody who called them, who wrote them, who showed up at their front door, which is hugely intrusive, the Beaumonts were friendly, welcoming, and open-minded towards. And that, I think, it's because they wanted the help. They appreciated the help, and they knew that they couldn't pick and choose where that help came from, that if they wanted a chance of getting their kids back, they had to be open to every avenue, and they really were. And I give them a lot of respect because, honestly, I don't know if I could have done it. Every morning and every afternoon, Jim Beaumont walked the almost 2 miles from his house to the Glenelg police station. And he walked instead of drove because he wanted to look on the way. He wanted to keep his eye out for anything that may be connected to his children. He would take different routes from the house to Glenelg Beach, thinking that maybe they had possibly taken this route. Maybe they had walked home that day and something had happened, and he would find a shoe or Jane's book or Jane's purse or a towel or something, and it would give him some sort of lead, some sort of evidence. Every morning and every afternoon, he walked to the police station, and he walked inside, and he asked them if they had any news. And every morning and every afternoon, the detectives shook their heads sadly. And it took Nancy Beaumont a little bit longer to face the media, to face anybody. She'd been racked with guilt since the second she realized something was wrong. She blamed herself, right? We understand that she blamed herself. She's not to blame because you can't blame somebody for something like this. She didn't kidnap the children, but she blamed herself, as most of us would probably as well. And yeah, she was heavy with that guilt she put on herself. She hadn't eaten in days. She had to be heavily medicated. She basically slept for an entire week, and it took 6 days for her doctor to clear her to speak in front of the cameras. And even then, she was incredibly unable to keep it together. She was smoking a cigarette. Tears were running down her cheeks in a steady stream. She sat next to her husband, Jim, who kept a reassuring arm around her shoulder the entire time, and she would sometimes have to turn her face into him so that she could sob before turning back to the reporters and saying, quote, "Excuse me for crying in front of you fellows," end quote. Can you imagine your 3 children? Every single thing that you care about and love in the world is gone in 1 second, and you're crying in front of the cameras, and you've got to apologize to people because you feel just so like, I don't know, I don't even have the right to cry. This is my fault. That's how she was feeling. And it seemed as the days went on with no sign of the children, Jim and Nancy adopted very different outlooks, very different coping mechanisms. Jim told himself and everybody else that his kids were alive. They were okay. Maybe some slightly eccentric, lonely woman who had found herself unable to bear children had taken them, and she was caring for them in some little out-of-the-way cottage, and they would be home within no time. Nancy, however, she had very little hope. To put it simply, she was completely broken. And she said, quote, "My children are dead, and I know it. I mustn't think they are, but I can't be stupid. It's just been too long. I don't think they are alive. I've said prayers. I want my children to come back. I don't want anything else. All the things you thought were important don't matter. Even our home is incidental now. I'd rather we were all together in a tent on the beach. I'm numb. I can't feel my stomach, and I can't feel my head. I don't know what's happening. I just know that our Janie was a lovely girl, modest and kind, and a wonderful daughter. Arno was a lovable little thinker and so beautiful. Grant was our son, only 4 years old, and now they're dead. I think as a mother, I'd rather kill the children myself and get it over quickly than have them at the mercy of some bad person for so long." And all of that, I mean, it's deep, it's sharp to hear, but it really resonated with me. I felt that. She made some extreme statements, such as towards the end where she said, "I think as a mother, I'd rather kill them myself than this." But I think we know what she meant. I think we understand. This is often how parents of abducted and missing children feel. they feel that it would be better. It would be better to know that their children were dead for sure, because then you know at least they're no longer suffering. Then you don't have to wonder what's happening to them, who has them, and what is that person doing to them. You don't have to lay awake every night thinking, who's torturing my child at this very moment while I'm laying in my soft, warm bed? Who's hurting my child? What's happening to my child? Is my child crying for me? Is my child feeling that I don't love them because I'm not coming to save them? All of those thoughts going through your head, yes, knowing that your child is dead would be preferable. And the statement where she said, even our home is incidental at this point. Nothing matters besides them. I totally got that. And I think that this is something very important to keep in mind as we go through, day by day. Life is hard, right? But none of it matters. The only thing that matters is the people that you love, the people who love you. And at the end of the day, we get in fights with our kids, with our husbands, with our parents, with our family members, and we hold grudges for stupid things. And we, give them the silent treatment, or we just spend so much time berating each other and fighting each other, not understanding that there's no point to do that, because at the end of the day, if that person was lost to you, you would regret everything. You would regret spending so much time fighting and so much time being angry when you could have spent that time loving them and being happy with them. And then at that point, you would give away everything you owned in order to just have them back with you even for one moment. So it all is very, it's all very true. It's all something that you really need to have perspective about. And unfortunately, so many of us don't have that perspective until something really bad happens and then it's too late. The police investigation continued on for a month, but with no signs of the Beaumont children, it quickly stalled out. Dr. John McGeorge, Australia's leading criminal psychiatrist, he stated his belief that the children were dead, and he theorized that their killer had been inspired by the Moors murders from the previous January. Now, the Moors murders, that refers to serial killers Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, who between July 1963 and October of 1965 abducted, tortured, and sexually abused 5 children before murdering them and burying them on Saddleworth Moor in England. And I mean, it's much more complicated than that. Even to this day, all of these children's bodies have not been found, but Ian and Myra were eventually taken into custody and arrested. I have a 3-part series on these crimes, which I will link for you in the description box if you haven't seen them yet. It's a very devastating and sad case, but riveting if you want to check it out. Dr. McGeorge also said that he believed whoever had taken the Beaumont children had done so either because they had an axe to grind with the family, or they wanted to hold the children for ransom, or they were a psychopath or a borderline mental case with a perverted twist. Since the Beaumont family had no money and no known enemies, it was most likely the latter. McGeorge said that the kidnapper might be a reserved, retiring person who either lived in a boarding house or with their aging parents. The kidnapper was most likely a man, and he could be married, but it wasn't likely. And if he had any friends, they were few and far between, because this man would keep to himself for the most part. He would have limited intelligence, he would act impulsively, and he could be a laborer or an unskilled worker who may have had trouble with the law before, but only for minor offenses. And this profile may have been helpful if the police had any suspects to compare it to. But there were no suspects, and there was no evidence. However, Dr. John DeGeorge did have a reputation for accurately predicting the outcome in cases such as this. He had done so within 3 days of another high-profile kidnapping from 6 years prior. The 1960 kidnapping and murder of 8-year-old Graham Thorne introduced the concept of stranger danger to the children of Australia, and it was also the first case in which forensic science was used in a criminal investigation. It all started on June 1st, 1960, when Sydney resident and traveling salesman Basil Thorne became a household name after winning £100,000 in the Sydney Opera House lottery. And listen, £100,000 is a lot of pounds, no matter which way you cut it. But in today's money, that's around £3 million. It's a lot of money. And Basil Thorne wasn't a rich man to begin with. He was a traveling salesman, similar to Jim Beaumont. He and his family which included his son Graham and I believe 3 daughters. They lived in like a tiny flat, a rented flat. They didn't have any money, and all of a sudden, overnight, they were incredibly wealthy, and they were all over the papers and their names and their address, because apparently in these days it was customary to print the address of a lottery winner. Make it make sense, because it doesn't. But anyways, they're all over the papers, and Basil's smiling face, he's in there. I mean, he's finally made it. He's been working his ass off, working his fingers to the bone for his entire adult life, and now finally he can give his family the life that he thinks they deserve. And a man named Stephen Bradley, that's not his original name. He was originally from Hungary, so Stephen Bradley was the name he adopted so that, it was easier for Australians to say. But he was a married father of 3 who had immigrated from Hungary and who was actually facing mounting debt after he'd recently lost his very good job. He actually worked as an insurance salesman, and he was pretty, well off. So Stephen Bradley is in a super negative mindset. Stuff's not going great for him, and he reads this story in the paper about Basil Thorne winning all this money, and Basil Thorne's address in the paper. And Bradley was pissed, right? Because he had created quite a lavish life for himself and his family, working as a car insurance salesman. And now that he lost that job, that life was slipping through his fingers, and he desperately wanted to keep his big house and his expensive car, so he hatched a plan to kidnap the 8-year-old son of Basil Thorne and hold him for ransom. Bradley grabbed little Graham as the boy walked home after school, and then he demanded £25,000 from Basil and his wife, Freda. He said that they had to pay him the money or he would feed their only son to the sharks. At one point, Stephen Bradley wrapped a scarf around Graham's face and put him in the trunk of his car so that he would not have to hear the child crying. Now, Stephen Bradley claimed that when he opened the trunk, Graham was dead. He was either on the verge of death or he was already dead. And I mean, it makes sense because Graham would have no access to oxygen. He had a scarf wrapped around his face and his arms were tied behind his back so he couldn't move the scarf, and he was in a trunk. So, we don't really know exactly what happened. Actually, this is a very, very interesting case, especially with the forensic aspect and how they ended up catching Stephen Bradley. If you want me to cover it on my channel, let me know. We can do a deep dive like we're doing here, because I personally had never heard of this case before. And just reading about it to, interject it or insert it into this video, I was like, wow, there's so much to talk about here. I can't even touch on it in this video. But basically, Stephen Bradley claims when he next opened the trunk, Graham was no longer breathing. And so he got rid of the body because he was like, oh, crap, I didn't mean for this to happen. He got rid of the body, but he kept asking Graham's parents for money. And the autopsy actually showed that Graham had died from a blow to the head and asphyxiation. Stephen Bradley denied hitting Graham in the head or hitting him at all, claiming that Graham could have just struck his head on the spare tire in the trunk. But the medical examiner reported that the young boy had suffered a violent death, and the medical examiner did not think that the head wound, which was quite deep, could have been caused by a spare tire. It just blows my mind that Stephen Bradley, who had 3 children of his own, could do this to a child. But like I said, if you want me to cover it in a separate deep dive, let me know. Now, when this had all happened, before Graham's body was found, Dr. McGeorge had predicted accurately that the boy would not come home alive. And now he was predicting the same fate for Jane, Arna, and Grant Beaumont. In November, after the children had been missing for 6 months, famous Dutch clairvoyant Gerard Croiset became involved in the case. Gerard Croiset was born in Holland in 1909, and from a very young age, he claimed to have visions. As a young boy, he trained as a watchmaker, and he said that he could sense events that were going to happen in his employer's life simply by coming into contact with personal objects that belonged to his boss. And apparently, according to his employer, the watchmaker, he accurately predicted these things. When he was 15 years old and working as a farmhand, Croiset said he had a vision of his father collapsing in Amsterdam. And when he arrived a few hours later to the location in his vision, he was told that his father had suffered a heart attack and passed away. Gerard Crosset has been called the man with the X-ray mind. He's also been called the Mozart of psychics, and he didn't receive such high praise for nothing. And he's been studied by scientists. Like, apparently, a lot of people think he's legit and he's the real deal. Once again, he led a very interesting life. There's a lot of interesting things about this guy, and I'm actually going to link a documentary about him that I found on YouTube. It's not in English, but there are subtitles, so you can read the English subtitles. But the whole X-ray mind thing that, people say about Gerard Crosset apparently stems from an incident from when he was 10 years old, when a girl in his class hurt herself, and he was able to figure out that she had fractured her arm just by holding her arm and looking at it. When asked how he knew, little Crosset responded, quote, "I saw the dark fracture area in the bone, like I was looking at an X-ray." After World War II, Crosset began assisting law enforcement in the searches for missing people, and according to his biographers, he has solved some of the century's most baffling crimes. He's traced countless lost objects and helped locate hundreds of missing people. Like I said, he's actually a super interesting person who convinced a lot of smart individuals, including scientists, that he was the real thing. Apparently, he is like the psychic who's been studied the most and examined the most by scientists, and even they couldn't figure out like how he was faking it. They just couldn't figure it out, which doesn't mean he wasn't faking it. It means that a ton of smart people couldn't figure out how he was faking it. I wish I could spend longer talking about Gerard Crosset and his life, but for our purposes here, we need to be focused. I'm telling you this as if you're the ones who need to know, but actually in reality, I'm telling myself that we need to stay focused because I have a tendency to get distracted by cool side stories, and then before you know it, one series is 9 parts and we haven't even gotten to the main plot point yet. So I will exert a modicum of self-control and talk about Gerard Crosset only in relation to the Beaumont children. So local businessman Barry Blackwell had sent Gerard Crosset aerial footage of the spot from where the children had vanished from. Barry Blackwell had actually paid for a helicopter to fly over and get this footage, and then they sent it to the psychic. And Gerard Crosset claimed that as he viewed the footage, he'd had a vision that the children were buried alive in a place that they could not escape from, that they were no longer alive, but there'd been no foul play involved. The children had just been playing in like a cave or something like that. There'd been some kind of collapse, and then they were unable to push past the fast rushing water and sand coming towards them. A woman who lived in Adelaide and who'd read about Crosset's visions announced that she believed she knew the area he was referring to, the area he'd seen in his vision where the children's bodies would be found. Her name was Mrs. Woodlands, and she was an employee at the Minda Home, which was a facility in Brighton that provided residential support and education for people with developmental disabilities. Mrs. Woodlands said that as soon as she read the description in Gerard Crosset's vision, it immediately reminded her of this lonely area in front of Minda Home, and the home actually sat on the beach in Brighton. So police searched the area, but they found nothing. Then a Brighton-based undertaker named Doug Trevelyan came forward and said that he remembered there was a 112-year-old family crypt buried under the sand near Minda Home. And from what he knew about the crypt, it looked very much like what Gerard Crosset was describing. The crypt had been built for the family who had owned the property in the 19th century, the Featherstone family, and according to records, the tomb was concrete, approximately 8 feet deep, 14 feet long, and 10 feet wide. In 1954, the roof had caved in, and 8 bodies had to be removed. But after that, a person could enter the tomb through the portion of the roof that had caved in. One resident of Brighton said that he had seen children going in there to play, and he'd seen children climbing into the tomb as recently as December of 1965. So they started looking for the tomb, but it was like buried under sand, so they couldn't really find it. And I mean, this search involved dozens of people, tons of machinery. The tomb was never found, though. It seemed to have vanished along with whatever secrets it held. Even though a ton of people said they knew where it was, nobody actually did in reality. So it was decided that Gerard Crosset needed to fly to Adelaide in order to get closer to the area where the children had vanished, since he was known for his psychometry, which is the ability to discover facts about someone or something by touching objects associated with that person or with an event. And it would make sense for him to do this work in person, so he could just touch things and hopefully get more visions. Now, at this time, the Beaumont family, they were in bad financial straits. Obviously, Jim had found it difficult to return to work in the months after his children vanished, and as the only person working in the household, he was unable to pay the bills and make ends meet. When Jim Beaumont announced that he and his wife were planning to sell their home in order to donate to a reward fund for information leading to the recovery of their children, several local people stepped in. Barry Blackwell was one of them. He was the managing director of Midway Motors in Brighton. He was also a friend of the family, and he publicly announced that he thought it was unacceptable to think that these parents should have to sell their home, lose their home that they raised their children in, so they could, get some information, get some help. And he began raising funds himself and donating money to the reward fund. He also organized extensive searches of storm drains on the beaches after finding out that the children would sometimes play in those drains. Another businessman, Con Polides, who was quite wealthy and who had reportedly known Nancy Beaumont in her younger single years, he also donated money to the reward fund. Now, originally, the reward fund had been only £500, and this amount had been put up by the South Australian state government 10 days after the disappearances. And then obviously, randomly here and there, other people would add funds when they could, giving what they could. For instance, an older man, a retired doctor who was on a pension, donated £100, and a Melbourne newspaper donated £2,000. Barry Blackwell, he added £2,000 to the reward fund himself, stating that he didn't feel the government's contribution was impressive, saying, quote, "I don't think enough incentive has been offered to urge anyone knowing the details of the children's mysterious disappearance to come forward," end quote. Basically, like £500 isn't going to make people start talking about missing children. Jim Beaumont still promised that if information did come out that led to the whereabouts of his children, he would sell his house, and that would add £4,000 to the reward fund. He said that nothing else mattered. If they had their children back, they could live anywhere. They could do anything. Having them back was the only thing he and his wife cared about. A house could be replaced. Now, Barry Blackwell ended up paying half to fly Gerard Crosset to Adelaide so that the psychic could hopefully garner some finer details by being closer to the location where Jane, Arna, and Grant had vanished from. He was greeted at the airport by throngs of press and onlookers who wanted to see the man with the X-ray mind for themselves. One documentary I saw about the Beaumont children said that his reception at the airport rivaled that of the Beatles. What? That's bananas. But noticeably absent in the adoring fans were Jim and Nancy Beaumont. Jim had candidly told a reporter, quote, "What kind of parents would we be, greeting the man who believes our children are dead? If he wants to meet us, that will be fine, but it will be in private. Mr. Crosset has been coming on and off for 6 months, and the doubt about it all has been very upsetting to us. We would like to see him come and to get it over with, whatever he is going to do." End quote.
Do you hope that Dr. Crozet succeeds, Jim? Oh, well, I mean, that's his belief, and I really appreciate him coming over. I mean, to find the children.
I think it'd be very difficult for him to meet us. I think he's a very feeling man, and I think that his main objective is finding the children more so than talking to us, perhaps.
Basically, Gerard Crosset had been coming up with all of these visions, for the past several months. And he'd been saying, oh, I see this, now I see this, now I see this, and sort of trying to find a way to tie all of these visions in together. But, I can understand Jim Beaumont saying, like, this has been exhausting. It's been exhausting. It's this emotional roller coaster, and he can do what he has to do, but we're not going to go there and, ask for his autograph. If he wants to talk to us, he can come to us, and it'll be a private conversation. Gerard Crosset visited the last known area of the Beaumont children on the morning of November 8th, 1966. He walked around, he took a lot of pictures, he made notes, he went to the Coley Reserve lawn, and he sat on the bench where the elderly couple had sat with their granddaughter as they watched this strange man play with Jane, Arna, and Grant Beaumont. He walked the way the children would have walked to reach the cake shop and the bus stop, And then at the corner of Mosley and Roberts Streets, Crosette had to pause because he was having a vision. Later that afternoon, Crosette had another vision, after which he grabbed a pencil and paper and he began drawing. He sketched a small schoolhouse, a road cutting, 2 posts lying on the ground with another post lying across them, and a fence with a portion of a foreshore in the background. For those who don't know, foreshore is the portion of the seashore between the high and the low water marks, or between the water and the developed or cultivated land. In that last sketch of the fence and the foreshore, Crosette had marked an area that he believed the Beaumont children would be found. The next day, he was told that a reporter had identified one of the areas in a vision that Crosette had while still in Holland, and it happened to be just a few hundred yards away from Minda home. But then everything suddenly changed after Gerard Crosette received a call on the evening of November 10th from a woman who claimed the children were buried in a warehouse near her home, and this warehouse happened to be right around the corner from the Beaumont home. This warehouse had been run down and abandoned, but it had recently been rebuilt just in the previous 2 months. So the warehouse would have been run down and abandoned at the time the Beaumont children went missing. But then, months later, it was basically redone, refinished, and, kind of updated so that it could be used again. So the next morning after getting that phone call, Gerard Crosette visited this warehouse, which was in Paringa Park. And then he gave a press conference where he announced he now believed the Beaumont children were buried 9 feet deep near the wall of the warehouse's storage room. Gerard said, "Listen, I know this isn't like all my other visions. I know it doesn't really match up because I said I saw them in a place where sand and water was rushing in on them and whatever. Visions are not always what they seem to be. And you can misinterpret your own vision. You can get a vision and then really not understand what that vision means. That's what happened here." He said, "I saw cement and I assumed the children were in some bunker or something like that, trapped there. But now he realized what he'd been seeing all along was this old, newly renovated warehouse. He said the children had probably gone into the building that night looking for shelter because they were afraid to go home. Now, he never specified why they were afraid to go home, but I think the implication is clear, which is why it was no surprise when Jim and Nancy Beaumont were a bit cold and detached during their first and only meeting with Gerard Crosette the night before he flew back home. However, it was a pretty short meeting, just about 15 minutes, but they did end up warming up to Gerard Crosette within, a few minutes. Jim told Gerard that, they just have to agree to disagree. He said, "I think my kids are alive. Nothing's going to change my mind. And unless you can prove that they are not alive, unless you find their bodies, I will never believe that they are dead." And Gerard Crosette nodded, and he was like, "I get it. I hope that you're right. I don't want them to be dead. It's just what I see. But I hope that you are right, and I hope they're alive. And until we find them alive or dead, I'll continue to do everything that I can to help you, locate your children." And the Beaumonts presented Crosette with a little gift, a kangaroo leather writing case. Hold on. Earlier when I was writing the script, and I was picturing what I was writing in my mind, as I always do, I saw a little brown writing case with a picture of a kangaroo embroidered on it. But now, as I'm seeing it out loud, I think that they meant the case was made out of kangaroo leather. The skin of a kangaroo. Oh my God, I'm so sad. I love kangaroos. That is tragic. Anyways, I did want to mention that by this time, Nancy had changed her stance on the fate of her children. Since several months had passed, she seemed to have adopted the more hopeful and positive outlook that her husband, Jim, had maintained since day one. On the first anniversary of her children's disappearance, Nancy dreamt of them. She said she saw them in her sleep coming home, and the dream was so real she could feel the tears on her face as she gathered them up and held them in her arms. She told the press, quote, "Jim and I are both convinced that the children are alive. I know I said I believed they had been murdered the week they disappeared, but I was sick then. The doctor had kept me asleep. But if the children had been murdered, their bodies would have been found. You couldn't hide 3 bodies, and who would murder 3 children?" End quote. As we know, and as we'll find out just as we go throughout this series, there are all sorts of people who have no reservations about hurting children. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley are just one or two people that pop into my head. There are people out there who would do that, but I understand at this point, you have to have hope. You have to have hope. I think it would be hard for me to have hope, but Nancy had to have hope, and so she got on board this hope train. And Jim Beaumont said something like, if we didn't feel like they were still alive, how would we keep going on? How would we do anything? How would we function? So I completely get it. After Gerard Crosette left Australia, the police had a decision to make. There was a lot of public pressure for them to pursue the psychic's claims, go to this warehouse and bulldoze it and dig it up, even though it had just been refinished. So an investigation began into this warehouse to see whether or not these claims are even possible. And the police said that they talked to a bunch of people who worked in the area when the kids went missing. They talked to people who were familiar with the building, who had worked in that building at one point, and they said it was determined that Crosette's claims could 100% not be possible, and that any excavation would prove fruitless. At least that's what the South Australian Premier, Frank Walsh, said. But the public, they were not hearing it. They were not having it. They believed in Crosette's vision, and they formed a committee. They raised a ton of money. They made a lot of noise, and they demanded that Crosette's claims be investigated thoroughly, meaning the warehouse, it would be dug up. That was the only way to determine, beyond a shadow of a doubt, whether or not the Beaumont children were there. The funds to complete the excavation were raised by March of 1967, and they started digging, intending to get as deep as 12 feet. And as they did this, workers encountered many different items, odds and ends. And all of these things were given to the police so that they could be, stored in evidence and tested. And it was just random items, things that you'd kind of expect to be at a work site. There was the cuff from a shirt, lollipop wrappers, old newspapers from the year 1965, papers that you would bring with you for lunch and discard, lollipop wrappers, lemon peels. I don't know if I said either of those things yet, but stuff like that. I think the fact that they found papers from 1965 lets you know that probably that's the last time that ground was disturbed. But either way, what they did not find were the bodies of 3 children. But even so, Gerard Crosette, he did not pivot. He did not change his story. He climbed up on that hill and he said, I'm going to die on this hill. You guys should have dug deeper. Like I said, through all of that, Jim and Nancy Beaumont, they held on to hope that their children were still alive, even after 1 year passed, and then another year, and then another year, with no new leads and no evidence. And then in February of 1968, a letter arrived for the Beaumonts. And this was nothing new because they'd been getting letters from all over the world. Some letters with words of hope, comfort, and support. Some letters with sentiments of hate, shame, and accusations directed towards the grieving parents. But this letter was different because this letter was signed Jane, Arna, and Grant. And that is where we will pick up next time. So thank you all very, very much for being here. I know some of you don't like deep dives as much as you like the Coffee and Crime Times and the shorter videos, but some of you love deep dives, and you're who I'm doing these for, and also for myself because I love deep dives. But anyways, thank you so much for being here. Don't forget to do a couple of things for me. 1, check out Glasses USA in the description box. Great glasses, the best glasses you'll ever get. So easy to shop, so affordable. Amazing. Highly recommend. 10 out of 10. Next, don't forget to check out my coffee company, Criminal Coffee Company. Christmas is coming up. The holidays are here. I really do think that Criminal Coffee is the best coffee, or else I wouldn't say that, and I wouldn't be attempting to, have you try it and then sitting here talking about how good it is, because if it wasn't good, you'd pretty quickly figure that out, and then you'd think I was a liar and I'd lose my legitimacy. This is good coffee. Trust me, really, really good coffee. Makes great hot coffee, makes great iced coffee. It's just delicious. And you can go and click the link in my description box and check Criminal Coffee out for yourself. You can buy it for yourself. You can buy it for a gift. You've got to have somebody in your life who's into, true crime, who's into mysteries, things like that. And they'll get a kick out of the coffee, the packaging, the whole story behind it, because we do donate a portion of our proceeds to helping fight crime, and then they'll also love how delicious the coffee is. So go check that out in the description box. Also, don't forget to check out my podcast, Crime Weekly, that I co-host every single week with retired police detective Derek Levasseur, who also happens to be my partner in criminal coffee. So go check both of those things out. Also, don't forget to hit like if you liked this video, share it if you think it's worth sharing, and leave me a comment, especially if you're in Australia and you remember this case, or you know about this case, or you know about any of the plethora of things that I asked about Australia. Let us know in the comments section. You know I love talking to you guys there. Also, don't forget to follow me on social media, Instagram and Twitter. I'm not on Twitter a lot because I hate Twitter with the passion of a million burning suns, but I do go on every so often just to see if anybody's trying to contact me on there, although I do try to avoid it. But Instagram is great. I always have updates there. So don't forget to follow me there. Thank you all so much for being here. Stay kind, stay beautiful, stay safe, and I will see you very, very soon. I won't make you wait a long time for the next part. Bye.
Well, the levee don't break now, and the bottle's going straight down, and that river runs deep, the mountains get steep, and the voices getting too loud. Oh, these feelings I've buried, it's looking like a cemetery. They're coming back from the grave, calling out my name, better say a Hail Mary. Well, you don't know how deep it goes until it's getting you slowly. So you got to let it go. I got blood on the strings.